Hi there, welcome to Floating in Books. Today's video is going to be my top 10 favorite Gothic fiction novels and 5 honorable mentions which are on my TBR that I would like to read. So yes, I thought that in line with my Dark Academia video that I did for you last month, I could also tell you some like more spooky, wintry kind of reads because I like some gloom in the gloomy months. Maybe that's just me. I know some people just want uplifting things, but I want all the gloomy things. So the way I'm going to be organizing today's video is that I have 5 classics for you. I think they all are, yeah, pretty much. And then I have 5 like of my top favorites, which also includes some classic-y kind of things. And then I have 5 newer things to me that I would like to get to at some point. So I did a Gothic fiction video, I think a couple of years ago, which is actually, this is really funny. So I used to do book videos over on my other channel, and the most popular video on that channel isn't makeup related at all, even though I'm mostly talking about makeup on there anymore, because I moved all the other topics to this channel. But the most popular video on that channel is my Gothic fiction book video, which I filmed in like 2017, which is when I lived in a completely different place. So yeah, we're talking all things Gothic fiction again today. I'll link the other video down below. There may be overlaps here. I didn't go back and watch that video first. And before we get to it, I do want to point out what Gothic fiction actually officially is. But there are going to be a couple of books here that I don't feel necessarily match the description, and there is going to be a little bit of overlap with some of the books I showed you and recommended to you for Dark Academia, because when I found out what Dark Academia actually meant, I was like, yeah, but there are so many things that I love that could fit the Dark Academia sort of vibes, because Dark Academia is not really a genre, it's more like an aesthetic, a vibe. And Gothic fiction is actually a completely different thing, but I think that some Gothic fiction can be Dark Academia and some Dark Academia can be Gothic, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing. So that's why there is a bit of overlap there, but I don't think a lot. But to me, Gothic fiction is something that I actually took courses on when I was at university. So I have a very different connotation when I hear Gothic fiction than maybe most people. So Gothic fiction as a like subgenre within fiction is a type of literature where not necessarily gloom, it's actually described using a German word, which is unheimlich, which I think is mostly translated as like this uncanny sort of gloomy feeling, much more again an atmosphere that underlies the narrative rather than it being like super spooky. So a ghost story can just be a ghost story. It doesn't have to be Gothic fiction if it doesn't have that sort of like, ooh, kind of feeling to it. I think that a very good example of something that I think is quite Gothic-y is something like Stranger Things, even though that's like sci-fi, you know? But I think that that's a really good example of something that's a bit more modern that I would definitely think falls into this Gothic fiction category where, you know, it's dark, it's gloomy, we don't know what's going on for the most part. We have this like impeding doom that just underlies the narrative, even though like people fall in love and they have all these other things going on. But there's always this sort of undertone that's really dark and like unsettling almost. And that's sort of where we're coming from with these books as well, that I either hope they'll give me or that I feel my top 10 definitely did give me. So let me start with my classic picks first. I'm gonna go through these quickly because I don't want to sound like a broken record. Officially, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley isn't necessarily Gothic fiction. It's the wrong era. Gothic fiction as a genre didn't really come about until like the late 19th century, but I feel that it definitely has some Gothic-y undertones, especially when the monster is sort of starting to live its own life at a certain point, and Victor Frankenstein, the scientist that the novel focuses on, is very much haunted by his invention. There is this moment in the story where Frankenstein is like, what have I done? not helped by the monster itself, who actually sort of goes like, why did you create me? Nobody wants me. Like, he's trying to do good, but he doesn't know how, and because he wasn't taught. And I feel that that's why this story doesn't start Gothic, but there are definitely Gothic elements. I think there is this scene where Frankenstein is fleeing from the monster, and he like is in this little boat in like this like stormy kind of weather, and I think that that scene in itself gives this book the Gothic quality that I would like it to have. This is one of my favorite all-time books for sure. I've reread this several times. It's a great classic, I think, to get into, but just know, if you just know this from popular culture, just know that the novel itself may be very different from what you had expected it to be. That's always with these classics that are very sort of prominent in popular culture, especially if it's more horror-based. This isn't horror. This isn't horror. It's more like science experiment gone wrong. That's pretty much where we go with this. So this is one that I think is good, but you do need to be careful with your expectations going into it. I think that that's one of the reasons why, I think that's actually one of the most important reasons why people sometimes don't like classics, is because you've heard so much about them already. So in a way, they're very hyped up that they can like never live up to people's expectations. Just know that was like dark and gloomy and scary to people at the end of the 18th century is very different to what we in the 21st century find scary or strange or whatever. So you do need to, you know, bear that in mind. I always like recommending a bit of Edgar Allan Poe if we're talking Gothic fiction. Again, not an author where everything is necessarily Gothic. And I've had discussions with people in the past where it's like, Edgar Allan Poe isn't Gothic. And I'm like, but I feel that most of the stories that I like the most by him, Telltale Heart, Pit and the Pendulum, Fall of the House of Usher, and also The Raven as well, like those stories and poems by him, I feel all have this like dread, like this gloomy, dark, weird sort of thing going on. And I'm like, that's why I like Edgar Allan Poe. So maybe that's not all of his works. It's not all of it, because he pretty much invented the detective story. I mean, he has a lot of other things that he does in his writing. But I just feel, and I'm pretty sure that in my Dark Academia or other videos I've shown you another edition, but I have an edition of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories that has these 1970s like prints in them, and they just look right out scary. Like you open that book and you're afraid. So I feel that Edgar Allan Poe is sort of like our starting point, where I think a lot of authors of like horror novels and also horror movies have very much looked at like the elements of his stories that give us horror and that were horrifying to people, but I feel that in Edgar Allan Poe, it's much more like psychological almost. It's more that like little nudge at your brain rather than like, ooh, it's very scary or anything like that. So that's why I think it fits Gothic fiction, because again, Gothic fiction doesn't have to be scary. It's just about gloom, doom, dreading, uncanny, unsettling feeling. And I definitely feel I get that from Edgar Allan Poe. Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is in pretty much every single video of recommendations I ever do. It's one of my all-time favorite novels as well. So this, I do have to say, it's been a while since I read this. I think I last read this when I was at university, so maybe I need to give it a reread to refresh my memory. I don't know, but this is another classic like Frankenstein, where I feel you need to be very careful if all you know is vampires from like popular culture, especially if they sparkle. There are no sparkling vampires in this. Bram Stoker's Dracula, I think, is a great Gothic read because it again has this sort of, like, there isn't immediate danger, but there is this like, what's going on here kind of vibe the entire time, especially when Van Helsing comes into the story. I feel that's when Jonathan Harker, our main character, starts to find out what's going on in this story, and that's when it's like, oh. Oh, so it's again one of those stories where I don't feel the whole thing is necessarily Gothic, but definitely elements of it are. And if you know that this book, which was published in the late 19th century, right before the year 1900, and that there was this fear in society, like if you remember 1999, there was this fear like what happens if the year 2000 hits? And that fear was there as well for people at the end of the 19th century, like what happens if 1900 hits? Apparently people get really nervous if we get a new century. And that this story in particular had people on their toes, like looking over their shoulder, like could this actually happen? Because what Dracula did that had never been done before, and why this book is so special in terms of vampire novels, is what we'll see in a minute, is that very up until this point, vampire stories had taken place in ruins in Germany or Italy. Stoker took vampires and placed it in contemporary London of the time. So people were afraid that this creature could actually be there hunting the streets of foggy Victorian London. That's the way you should see this. So if you know that about it, and you sort of think of this like as like, the way I like to think of this book is like of one of the first sort of urban fantasy kind of stories, where we get a mythological creature that is from a faraway country, and now it ends up here, and we need to understand what's going on. So I feel that this is again a very influential book, and I love myself some urban fantasy. It's like in terms of like categories within fantasy, urban fantasy is personally my favorite, because I like that sort of 1 foot in the real world, 1 foot in the magical world, and that's what we're getting here for sure as well. And I think that this is just a really clever book from that point. So definitely a good one, and one of my favorites for sure. Then again, a bit of an outlier perhaps, but I've always felt that Wuthering Heights is one of those books where it, again, the story itself isn't Gothic, but the atmosphere in this, I mean, we get the moors and the gloomy weather, and it just plays a really significant role in the book, I feel, as well. Because it's almost as if the weather is also like the mood of the characters. So in that sense, I feel that Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is another contender. Do I need to explain what this is about? Like, I didn't really give you much of a plot summary of these, but I hope you already know a little bit what these are about. But yeah, this is about Catherine and Heathcliff. There's a Catherine 1 and a Catherine 2, which is the point where you always get a bit confusing. Heathcliff has very often been described as like the character you hate to love, that sort of thing. But he's like one of the OG unlikable characters, I think, for sure. He's quite abusive. And this is just a story. I think a lot of people just read into it as a love story, but to me, there's just a lot more, because it's this, again, this like lingering sort of sense that keeps on going through this novel. And I think that that's why Wuthering Heights is another contender for being a great Gothic read. And finally, I told you about Dracula being very different from its predecessing vampire stories, and I actually have a short story collection called Dracula's Guest, a connoisseur's collection of Victorian vampire stories. So this book actually starts with some of the first vampire stories that, you know, were written in English. Some of it translated from German, I believe. And it's very much like, you know, a ruined castle, and then this nobleman and a horse comes by, and it's, instead of like meeting the beautiful princess in the tower, they meet a monster that drinks their blood. So it's very much this like fantastical element to it. This has The Vampire by John Polidori, which I believe was the story he wrote the night that Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein, so there's a link there too. But yeah, this, I believe, sort of starts at the end of the 18th century, and then it like sort of moves into where Dracula came from. So if you want the background of what vampire stories were like until we get Dracula, then this is the one to try. So if you want to explore more, then this is nice. I actually read this in the middle of summer when it was like super hot, so I don't know. Yeah, so it actually ends with the short story Dracula's Guest, which is like a chapter that was cut from the original manuscript from the book. So you get an extra bit of Dracula in here, and that's why it's called that. But yeah, that's the last story in the book. So yeah, if you want more Victorian vampire stories. My next deck features some more contemporary things. So I think that's all, yeah, that's all like 19th century, 18th century stuff. These are all 20th century or later. So I think that this is one of the reasons why I consider Wuthering Heights a Gothic novel as well, because I read this. This is Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn, and I got Wuthering Heights vibes from this book. This is set in Cornwall though, so it has a very different environment, but this also has like the fog on the landscape when she goes for a walk in the morning, and this does have more of a mystery at its heart, so in that sense it's even more gothic-y. But I believe with this, Daphne du Maurier also set out to sort of do her version of a 19th century gothic fiction story, so this definitely fits the bill. It's another one of my all-time favorite books. I keep recommending this for a reason. I just love this one, and I think, yeah, and that's why one of the things that's on my TBR is another Daphne du Maurier book, because I love this one so much. Now here we go into a bit of a bizarre twist. I don't think this is gothic fiction, but it does have very dark humor. Kill Your Friends by John Niven. Now this is one of those books that I never hear anybody talking about, but I loved this at the time that I read it. Now this is dark. This is very dark. This is about, this is about a like music producer in the early 90s, and he's like on top of the world. He's signing all of these acts, and he's a right old jerk. Like, he's not a nice person. And we meet him as he sort of moves around his career. The book is called Kill Your Friends because he ends up killing one of his friends. And I'm not giving away anything by that, but it's the way he deals with it that I feel makes this more of a gothic-y thing. This is very sort of slapstick humor as well at times, so it's not gothic per se for that reason, but it just... If gothic fiction can encompass morally gray characters, I've never read a book with a character that has absolutely no morals as much as this, even though everything is like very lighthearted and turned into a joke very often. I feel that because of the lack of morals going on in this, it deserves a spot in this top 10. This book by Angela Carter, The Magic Toy Shop, I don't think I had read this when I did my previous video. I could be wrong. I don't know. I've had this for a while. I have some other Angela Carter books, and it's another one of those authors that I came across as I was looking for other gothic recommendations. The Magic Toy Shop is about a girl who, I believe her parents die in a fire, and then she and her brother, I think, she needs to go live with her uncle and aunt, and her uncle is weird. This is again more on the weird side of gothic. It never gets truly scary, it never gets truly, but it's just a very strange book, and it's all down to the uncle. I almost felt as I was reading this that, you know, there was some sort of like abusive relationship going on, even though that's never told explicitly. It seems to be implied, so it's also a pretty sad story in that sense. But yeah, this uncle runs a toy shop, and he has this very weird fantasy about these things coming to life in this theater. It's just a very strange one, but I feel that that's why it makes for a very good gothic read. Another all-time favorite book of mine, not everybody likes this. This is very Marmite. This is Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. This is about Hazel Motes. And Hazel Motes comes back from the war, Second World War. This is like late 40s, early 50s, deep south of the United States. That's where this is set. And he tries to find his way now that he's a veteran. And in this, there's this like very heavy religious component in it, which is why I think this turns so many people away. But I thought that this, like where Kill Your Friends has morally gray, like doesn't seem to have any morals, Hazel Motes is another one of those morally gray characters where it's like, is he even trying to do the right thing or not? And that's why I like this. So this is much more, if Gothic fiction could be encapsulated in one single character, this is the one. This is set in sunny southern United States. So like there's all the reasons to be happy, and yet there is this all the time this gloomy sort of atmosphere, and that's definitely down to the character for sure. So that's why I always love this. This is definitely an unusual book. You need to go into this with an open mind for sure. And finally, sticking to the vampire theme we've got going on, The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. This was one that I also put in my Dark Academia video because I felt that this was just great. Now this is another one of those books where there's a bit of a mystery. We don't really know what's going on at first. It's told through diary entries as this woman travels with her father, as she's describing her travels as a child with her father across Europe. And he's trying to figure out why his PhD supervisor went missing. Turns out a very notorious vampire is trying to collect books, and he needs scholars to help him do it. So yeah, The Historian is definitely a very chunky read. It has that academia aspect because it's very much set in the academic world. It's got a lot of travel options there as well, but because we have this like mystery, and because she doesn't really know what's going on at first, like the question is all the time like, will my dad disappear as well? And even though she's bonding with her father and they have these lovely moments together, there's also this undertone because they both know that things could go wrong at any second. This is a slow burner of a book, which is again a characteristic I feel goes with Gothic fiction so well. Like it's always like sort of in the background. It never really comes to the forefront, and you never really know what's going on until the very final scenes in the book, which is why I love this one. And then really quickly, my TBR, I don't know much about these books. These are books I want to read because they are like very recent discoveries for me, or they've been on my TBR for a while, or they were recommended to me by people. So there's a lot going on here. So if a book is called Mexican Gothic, I want to read it. I don't even know what this is about. It's by Silvia Moreno Gastia. I believe this was on the like top 10 list of like Goodreads. That's why I picked it up. Thought it could be fun, and I'm very interested in reading some more like Gothic perspectives from other cultures as well, because everything I've read is quite Eurocentric. And then we have the Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Because I love Jamaica in so much, I want to read Rebecca. I got started on this a couple of years ago, only got to about 50 pages into it, didn't love it. I've now watched the movie, so I kind of know where the story is going. So I think I just need to skip ahead in this and like skip the south of France and just get started when they arrive at the house. I think that will be better for me. Matthew Lewis's The Monk. It took me some time before I could pick this up, but this was a recommendation people gave me on my original video over on the other channel as a suggestion I should read. I don't remember why anymore. It's been a few years, but whenever I was in a bookstore, I tried to find this, but it was difficult to find. So I ended up picking it up from Waterstones on one of my more recent London trips. And then two books that are a little bit more hyped up, also in the realm of dark academia. We have M.L. Rio's If We Were Villains, which is definitely one of those like dark academia kind of books. I believe this is again about like a secret society or like a group of friends and someone ends up dead, I believe. And then Gideon the Ninth is one that I see a lot of people talking about on TikTok. Now this is a one that I actually picked up really randomly from the book depository a few years ago already. I also have the sequel, Harrow the Ninth, and I believe there's another book in this series. I'm not sure anymore what it's called, but this is a running series, and I believe this is about necromancy. That's all I know, but I'd like to read this. I think that this may be the next book I pick up after I finish my current read. We'll see. So that's it for me for today. These are the Gothic fiction recommendations I wanted to give you. So thank you so very much for joining me. Leave me a comment down below where you leave your Gothic fiction recommendations. I would love to know. And yeah, stay tuned because I have more book videos coming your way for sure. Once a week on Wednesdays. So hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.